Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, President Kennedy reviews his trip to Costa Rica. In Chicago, Malcolm X speaks out. In Geneva, talks on a test ban treaty hit a roadblock. Boxer Davey Moore is hospitalized. Alcatraz is closed. And the Big O puts on a show in the NBA playoffs. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
A young lady fair with messy hair had a date with Tom to go to the prom. She was just getting over a cold. She shouldn't shampoo. What to do? You can't wet your hair, her mother said.
If you wash and go out, you'll be back in bed. But, my darling daughter, do what I always do. When you can't shampoo, Minapoo. Minapoo cleans hair without water. Whenever I have a cold, I'm in a hurry and can't shampoo. I just whisk Minapoo on, then brush Minapoo out. Out comes dirt and excess oil. And Minapoo is wonderful to remove sticky hairspray buildup. In stays my wave because no wetting means no resetting, and it only takes minutes. See? She used Minapoo, and her hair looked naturally soft, lustrous. And all night long she hummed this song.
When you can't shampoo, Minapoo.
In Washington this evening, President Kennedy reviewed his 3-day trip to Costa Rica, where he conferred with the presidents of 5 Central American countries and Panama. The president told a 6 p.m. news conference that the leaders and people of Latin America were determined to preserve freedom.
We agreed to continue our efforts under the Alliance for Progress to build and strengthen the machinery for economic cooperation with and among the nations of Central America and Panama. And we also agreed on the necessity for measures to halt the flow of agents, money, arms, and propaganda from Cuba to Central America. Every nation present was determined that we would both protect ourselves against immediate danger and go forward with the great work of constructing dynamic, progressive societies immune to the false promises of communism.
Later in the conference, the president dismissed reports that the Central American presidents had suggested stronger measures than he had against Cuba.
There was no proposal. I think they're quite aware that we have taken every conceivable action to isolate Cuba, that that's our ambition, as long as Cuba maintains a association with the bloc and is used as a communist military base. I don't think that the presidents of Latin America thought that further action, invasion, or blockade at this time would be fruitful. At least none of them made that proposal to me. And as you know, the burden of such an action would fall on the United States. And I think they're quite aware that it's the United States that would have to carry out the action, that we have responsibilities all through the world. We've just mentioned South Korea and Berlin as an example of 2 areas where we have vital commitments, so that I think the presidents of Central America are well aware that the United States is as anxious as they are to prevent the flow of communism in this hemisphere, and that we are taking every action that we believe to be responsible and effective to achieve that end. And they also recognize that one of the most effective ways is to meet conditions in their own country to make sure that communism doesn't get a grip because of the failure of the economies. One of the countries that we visited, 400 out of 1,000 of the children do not attend any school. We cannot expect stable democratic societies to develop in an atmosphere where half the population is illiterate. Now, that's the kinds of problems which have traditionally affected and infected Central America. The governments are attempting to meet these problems. We're attempting to help them through the Alliance for Progress. We believe that this is the most important step we can take now, combined with the actions we're presently taking against Cuba, which are well known.
Finally, the president was asked if the Soviets had honored their commitment to withdraw troops from Cuba.
We estimate that they have withdrawn approximately 3,000 troops in these past weeks. We are waiting to see whether more will be withdrawn, as we would hope they would be. The month of March is not finished yet. We should have a clearer idea as to what the total number should be in the coming days.
In Saigon today, U.S. military advisors characterized another large-scale South Vietnamese offensive as a failure. They said the reason the 5,000-man assault in the Mekong Delta region failed was that government troops left escape routes open for the communist Viet Cong in order to avoid the kind of close-in fighting the Americans have been urging. The advisors say Vietnamese commanders are leery of taking the heavy losses that may result from such fighting on the heels of the disastrous Battle of Ap Bac in January. In that battle, 83 South Vietnamese troops and 3 Americans were killed, and 5 U.S. helicopters were shot down. U.S. advisors also report that Vietnamese commanders have been launching operations where intelligence has shown communist strength to be minimal. One U.S. advisor recently wrote a sharply critical report on the situation, which prompted an American investigator to visit the Delta region. According to Neil Sheehan of UPI, the investigator reported back to Saigon, quote, "The only thing wrong with that report is that all of it is true," unquote. Despite the failure of this week's large-scale offensive, a second sizable operation was launched today elsewhere in the Mekong Delta. Several battalions of government troops, supported by naval assault boats, moved against communist positions in Kien Hoa province, 45 miles south of Saigon. No contact was reported, as the Viet Cong had apparently withdrawn or were holed up in their carefully prepared hideouts. A Paris newspaper published an interview with Fidel Castro today, in which the Cuban premier said that if Nikita Khrushchev had come to Cuba after withdrawing Soviet missiles last fall, quote, "I would have boxed his ears," unquote. Mr. Castro criticized the Soviet premier's actions in the crisis, declaring, quote, "He avoided war, but he did not win the peace. Cuba does not wish to be a pawn on the world's chessboard. Cuban sovereignty is a reality. I cannot agree with Khrushchev promising Kennedy to pull out his rockets without the slightest regard for the indispensable approval of the Cuban government," unquote. Meanwhile, talks in Geneva between U.S., Soviet, and British officials regarding a possible nuclear test ban treaty have stalled over the number of annual inspections to be allowed. This evening, President Kennedy was asked if he still held out hopes for an agreement, given the current stalemate.
Well, my hopes are somewhat dimmed, but nevertheless, I still hope. The fact of the matter is that the Soviet Union did accept in September a position which it had denied over the past 2 years or so of inspection. Now, what we are disagreeing about are the number of inspections, but at least the principle of inspection is accepted. Now, the reason why we keep moving and working on this question, taking up a good deal of energy and effort, is because, personally, I'm haunted by the feeling that by 1970, unless we're successful, there may be 10 nuclear powers instead of 4. By 1975, 15 or 20. With all of the history of war, and the human race's history, unfortunately, has been a good deal more war than peace, with nuclear weapons distributed all through the world, and the strong reluctance of any people to accept defeat, I see the possibility in the 1970s of the President of the United States having to face a world in which 15 or 20 or 25 nations may have these weapons. I regard that as the greatest possible danger and hazard. And now, I'm not even talking about the contamination of the atmosphere, which will come when all these nations begin testing. But as you know, every test does affect generations which are still away from us. So I think that when we're now talking Soviet Union, United States, whether we'll have 7 or 3, we've come this far, I think that we ought to stay at it. So I don't, not disturbed at all by those who attack every effort we make to get a nuclear test ban. The fact of the matter is that when the treaty is signed, if it ever is signed, and I hope it is, it must be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. Therefore, there seems to me great protection to all of us. Now, the other point I want to make is that we test and test and test, and you finally get weapons which are increasingly sophisticated. But the fact of the matter is that somebody may test 10 or 15 times and get a weapon which is not nearly as good as these megaton weapons, but nevertheless is 2 or 3 times what the weapon which destroyed Hiroshima or Nagasaki, and that was dreadful enough. So we're going to keep at it. Now, members of Congress who may object to that will have their chance to vote A or nay if we're successful in a treaty and we present it to the Senate. In the meanwhile, we're going to stay at it.
I'll have more news for you after this message.
When you have pimples, you need a medication developed specifically for this problem. You need the active medications prescribed by leading skin specialists, and that is Clearasil. Clearasil's 3 medical actions open, clean out, and dry up pimples fast. Here's how. Keratolytic action gently dissolves and opens affected pimple cap. Now clogged pore can drain, and antiseptic medication can penetrate to help clean out pore. Oil-absorbing action works to dry up pimples, helps prevent further outbreak. And Clearasil is skin-colored to hide blemishes while it works. Guaranteed to work for you or money back. Clearasil in stick, tube, or lotion, largest selling because it really works.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
At Dodger Stadium tonight, boxer Davey Moore collapsed in his dressing room an hour after being dethroned as featherweight champion by Sugar Ramos. He was taken unconscious by ambulance to White Memorial Hospital in Los Angeles. Ramos, rallying twice from near destruction, had scored a dramatic 2-knockdown 10th-round knockout over Moore. During the final knockdown, the back of Moore's neck struck the lower ring rope. There is speculation tonight that this may have caused his injury, the effects of which were not immediately apparent. Just after the fight, Moore, sitting in his corner, was interviewed by broadcaster Steve Ellis.
Dave, I know it was a tough one. What's the story? It just wasn't my night tonight. It wasn't your night tonight. It wasn't my night. David, now do you feel you'd like to get a return shot? Oh, definitely. I don't think he can lick me. You don't think he can lick me? I don't think so. Davey, I can fight much better. Do you feel in a return bout that you perhaps can land that big right hand? I think I can knock him out.
An hour later, the fighter collapsed. Clayton Fry, secretary of the California Athletic Commission, was in the dressing room at the time. Mr. Fry said Moore had been talking to his manager, Willie Ketchum, and, quote, apparently lapsed into unconsciousness, unquote. Ketchum said he thought Moore was suffering from exhaustion, but other witnesses said Moore had complained of pain in his head. When the unconscious fighter was rolled out of his dressing room on a transfer table, his eyes were closed, ice bags were placed on both sides of his head, and an oxygen tube was in his mouth. Later, a hospital spokesman said Moore had not regained consciousness and that he would shortly be examined by a team of neurosurgeons. The new champion, 21-year-old Sugar Ramos, was greatly upset by the news. Ramos is no stranger to such difficulties. In Havana in November of 1958, Jose Tiger Blanco died after a fight with Ramos. The black Muslims are stepping up their campaign for racial separation in this country. At their annual convention last month, the most outspoken Muslim on this point was Malcolm X, minister of Nation of Islam Temple 7 in Harlem and national spokesman for the group. Elijah Muhammad, the group's leader, did not attend the convention due to an illness. In a 2-hour speech at the Chicago Coliseum, Mr. X, speaking under a huge banner proclaiming, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his apostle," said, quote, "The white man is the greatest teacher of hate that ever walked the earth. It is time to get a divorce, and we want a property settlement," unquote. On Sunday, Malcolm X was the guest on City Desk, a public affairs program broadcast on WNBQ-TV in Chicago. The moderator was Jim Hurlbut, and the panel was composed of reporters Floyd Kalber, Charles McEwen, and Len O'Connor. Mr. McEwen asked the Muslim leader how he had joined the black Muslims.
I was in prison. I was a very wayward, criminal, backward, illiterate, uneducated, and whatever other negative characteristics you can think of type of person, until I heard the teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. And because of the impact that it had upon me in giving me a desire to reform myself and rehabilitate myself for the first time in my life, and also being able to see the effect that it had upon others, this is what made me accept it. And plus, prior to hearing what he teaches, I had no interest whatsoever in anything serious or any kind of educational pursuits. And I noticed that after being exposed to the religious teachings of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, immediately it instilled within me such a high degree of racial pride and racial dignity that I wanted to be somebody. And I realized that I couldn't be anybody by begging the white man for what he had, but that I had to get out here and try and do something for myself or make something out of myself.
Mr. O'Connor then had a somewhat contentious exchange with Malcolm X regarding his name.
What is your real name?
Malcolm X.
Is that your legal name?
As far as I'm concerned, it's my legal name.
Have you been to court to establish that
I didn't have to go to court to be called Murphy or Jones or Smith. Excuse me for answering you this way.
That's all right.
If a Chinese person were to say his name was Patrick Murphy, you would look at him like he's insane, because Murphy is an Irish name, a European name, or the name that has a Caucasian or white background. And if it doesn't look proper for a person who is yellow or Chinese to be walking around named Murphy or Jones or Johnson or Bunch or Powell, I think it would be just as improper for a black person to walk around with these names.
Would you mind telling me what your father's last name was?
My father didn't know his last name. My father got his last name from his grandfather, and his grandfather got it from his grandfather, who got it from the slave master. The real names of our people were destroyed during slavery.
Was there any point in the genealogy of your family when you did have to use the last name, and if so, what was it?
The last name of my forefathers was taken from them when they were brought to America and made slaves.
You mean you won't even tell me what your father's supposed last name was or gifted last name was?
I never acknowledged it whatsoever.
Finally, Mr. Kalber asked the minister for his views on James Meredith's enrollment at the University of Mississippi last fall. The enrollment, the first by a Negro at that school, required federal intervention and touched off riots that caused 2 deaths and scores of injuries.
Well, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad wants justice for every one of the 20 million so-called Negroes, and to just take one Negro and stick him in college with the aid of 15,000 troops is a disgrace. It's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's a farce. It's hypocrisy. Because if it's right for one Negro to be forced into that university, then every Negro in the state of Mississippi who is qualified has the same right to go to that university. And if the government is not ready and willing to enforce the right of every Negro in the state of Mississippi, then, in my opinion, sir, it's only hypocrisy to pretend that they are for justice by pushing one Negro in and blowing it up all over the world to make it look like they're solving the problem when millions of black people in that state are still going to segregated schools and getting an inferior education.
To further their goal of independence and separation from the white man, the black Muslims operate their own stores in several cities. They've opened Muslim schools as well. Malcolm X and others in the organization insist they do not teach racial hatred, black supremacy, or violence. On Alcatraz Island today, the federal prison's last 27 inmates were removed. During the investigation of the escape from Alcatraz last June by Frank Morris and John and Clarence Anglin, the erosion of the prison, caused mostly by the salt air that blows through the Golden Gate, was called to official attention. The 3 convicts, who are presumed to have drowned but whose bodies were never found, had used spoons to dig and cut their way out of their cells. James Bennett, director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, said it would cost $5 million to renovate the place, to improve the power and sewage disposal plants, and to build new quarters for personnel. Today, the last inmate to leave the prison was Frank Weatherman, 29 years old. Mr. Weatherman, a convicted gun smuggler, was transferred to Alcatraz last December for twice attempting to break out of the Anchorage jail in Alaska. Asked how it felt to be the last man off the rock, the boyish-looking convict smiled thinly and said, quote, "Good. Good for me, good for everyone. Alcatraz never was no good," unquote. Mr. Weatherman and the other convicts then boarded the prison boat, which departed for San Francisco. From there, the 27 prisoners will be transferred to new facilities. Sports, right after this.
Certs is a candy mint. Certs is a breath mint.
Stop. You're both right. New Certs is 2 mints in 1. Stops bad breath. Tastiest mint of all. Handy pocket roll comes in assorted delicious flavors. C-E-R-T-S. Certs.
Oscar Robertson, the magnificent Cincinnati point guard, tore Syracuse apart tonight as the Royals crushed the Nationals 133-115 at Cincinnati Gardens. In doing so, the Royals evened up their Eastern semifinal playoff series at 1 game apiece. The winner of the series will go on to play the defending champion Boston Celtics. In a rugged game that featured a wild bench-clearing brawl in the second period, the Big O scored 41 points, grabbed 15 rebounds, and assisted on 12 baskets. In the losers' dressing room after the game, 12-time All-Star Dolph Schayes, who made his NBA debut with Syracuse back in 1949, had high praise for Robertson's performance, stating, quote, "There are only 2 players I'd pay to see, Oscar and Bob Cousy. Cousy is more flashy, but makes many more mistakes. I've seen them all, and Oscar is the best," unquote. If the series needed some livening up, tonight's free-for-all may have done it. Midway through the second quarter, Cincinnati's Tom Hawkins came down with a rebound, and Al Bianchi grabbed him around the waist. Hawkins then threw an elbow, and that started the fireworks. As Lee Schaefer, the Nats' 6'7", 220-pound forward, moved in to help Bianchi, he was met by the formidable Wayne Embry, the Royals' 6'8", 250-pound center. Schaefer and Embry started swinging, and before order was restored, both benches had emptied. After the game, Syracuse coach Alex Hannum blamed the fight squarely on Hawkins, adding, quote, "We didn't come down here prepared for a game like this. We'll have to fight fire with fire," unquote. In the winner's dressing room, Hawkins dismissed the brawl as much ado about nothing, stating, quote, "I don't know what really took place in the fight, but I do know there weren't any punches landed. I never have seen very many punches landed in a basketball game," unquote. In Fort Myers, Florida today, the Pittsburgh Pirates handed the Minnesota Twins their 5th straight defeat of baseball's exhibition season, winning 5-4 in 10 innings. Minnesota loser Chuck Neeson put the winning run on base when he walked Bob Skinner with 1 out in the 10th. Don Clendenin singled to left, and rookie infielder Gene Alley hit a long single to center, scoring Skinner. The Pirates are counting on Clendenin to be the regular first baseman this year after trading slugger Dick Stewart to the Red Sox in November. Pittsburgh received right-handed starter Don Schwall in that deal. Also in November, the Pirates traded away shortstop Dick Grote, a key piece of their 1960 championship team, to the St. Louis Cardinals for pitcher Don Cardwell. This week, Danny Murtaugh, the Pirates manager, was asked for the strategy behind Pittsburgh's busy offseason.
We didn't think we had enough capable starting pitchers to win a pennant in our league. And when we found out that some of the pitchers that were available could be had by our ball club, it meant giving up some of our infielders. And then we further analyzed our replacements, and we felt that we had capable replacements in our own organization to replace the men like Grote, Hoke, and also Big Dick Stewart.
He was asked if the Pirates could win the National League pennant this year.
I would say in order to win a pennant in the National League, you have to have an awful lucky club. By lucky club, I mean that we still are undergoing that period where we haven't acquired the deep bench strength, and not only my ball club, but every club in the league, that you need. I say that because the fact that last year we had to undergo that allotment program in our league and giving up players to the other 2 ball clubs that just joined us. So therefore, not only my club, but every club in our league is a little weak on bench strength. And I use the word luck because I feel that the club that can keep their starting men in the lineup the greater period of time without injury has the better chance of winning. For example, I'll give you the LA club last year. Now, it looked like they were a shoo-in, and they had trouble with Koufax. He hurt his finger and couldn't pitch, and they couldn't reach down and get a capable replacement. So therefore, I would say that our league this year, there's about 6 or 7 clubs capable of winning it. I think we're going to have a pretty good ball club.
The Pirates went 93-68 last year. However, in a highly competitive National League, that was only good for 4th place behind the Giants, Dodgers, and Reds. And finally tonight, the new owners of the American Football League's New York Titans say the Big Apple should expect another first-class professional football team that might someday rival the New York Giants. Last Friday, the club was purchased for $1 million by a group of executives called Gotham Football Club Incorporated. On Tuesday, David Sonny Werblin, who leads the group, outlined his ambitious rebuilding plan, stating, quote, "We plan to give New York the best football we know. We'll go first class all the way. We still have some legal details to complete, but by next week, we'll start work to obtain the very best in management and playing material," unquote. Mr. Werblin said the team's name would be changed, but the new name has yet to be determined. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Thursday, March 21st, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.